Okay, so I'm very happy to introduce Alexandre Billon for the seminar, the Paris seminar on mathematical models of consciousness and cognition. Alexandre is professor at the Université de Lille, and he's written many articles on consciousness, pre-reflective self-consciousness, on psychopathology, depersonalization. He's got a paper called The Psychopathology of Metaphysics, which is a um, really nice topic, I think, in general. It's written on introspection, it's written on just many things. And most recently, he has a novel called Le Tutoiement des Mœurs, which I hear is getting great reviews. And I've known Alex for almost 20 years. He was a student finishing his PhD at CREA under Jean Petitot when I was a postdoc at CREA for a little while, and I served on his jury. And I'm very excited to see what Alexander has to say about non-well-foundedness and non-well-founded explanations. So great to see you, Alexander, and looking forward to your talk.
The invitation. And okay, so when I did my PhD, I considered some theories of consciousness that were fashionable, that are still quite fashionable, which I can call self-representational theories of consciousness. So let me write it. And those theories basically posit a form of self-reference or self-representation. And so, for example, a state R1 will be conscious if it represents itself. It might also represent the world. And those are classical. Some argue that Aristotle held a theory of these stores. Brentano held such a theory. And today, Ken Williford is one of the leading proponent of such theories. And he edited a book with Kriegel, who also advocated the theory. I think it was in 2009 or something, maybe 2006. And in my PhD, I quickly criticized the theory, claiming that they might lead to some kind of pathological self-reference. But I didn't say much about it. And when I tried to think about it, I realized that it was more complicated than what I thought. And so I started working on self-reference, just aside from working on consciousness. And I've published quite a couple of articles on the topic, in which I don't talk about consciousness, but I talk more broadly about self-referential theories of consciousness. Sorry, I don't talk about consciousness, I just talk about self-reference. And I'm happy to be here today because it's a chance for me to apply those works on self-reference to the self-referential theories of consciousness. So let me first present the rationale of these theories. Why do we want to say that a conscious state is a state that represents itself? So I think that the basic motivation comes from what we might call the meta-representational principle. It goes by many different names. Ken calls it the self-awareness principle. Some Rosenthal call it the transitivity principle. And these principles say that a state a conscious state of S is a state S is conscious of. So conscious state is a state you are conscious of. This so this can be translated as follows. If we so R2, a mental state R2 is conscious if R1 represents R2. So there are many things to add. Many philosophers would like to add things about the way R2 is represented in order to be conscious, but it won't be important for us here. Really, the idea is that our mental state R1 is conscious if it is represented by, our conscious state R2 is conscious if it is represented by a mental state. In fact, like that, but like that. R2. So mental state R1 is conscious if it's represented by a higher order state. And so this has led to some theories of consciousness which are called higher order theories, hot theories. So for example, Rodenthal holds such a view, but many people have claimed that higher order theories are not really okay, and that if we want to have a good theory of consciousness based on this meta-representational principle, we have to modify them so that and claim that R2 is in fact equal to R1. So basic idea, mental state is a state I'm conscious of, so then there must be some higher order mental state that represents it, maybe represented as being conscious. Second idea, it only works if R1 and R2 are identical. So why? Why would we need R1 and R2 to be identical? I think there are basically two arguments. One is an argument strictly for this claim, and the other is more an argument for the claim that R1, I don't know how to put it, that there will be some kind of non-wellfoundedness in our theory of consciousness. So let me just give you those two arguments. So from hot to self-representational theories of consciousness. The first problem with the higher order theory here is that first, when I have a conscious state, let's say I have a conscious pain, I'm usually absolutely certain that I'm in pain. And this seems to suggest that the relationship between R2 and R1 is very tight. In fact, the absolute certainty suggests that R1 is in fact part of R2. So I cannot have R2 without having R1. And another thing is intrinsicality. When I have a conscious pain, my pain seems intrinsically conscious. It seems conscious in itself. This consciousness doesn't seem to depend on a further mental state that represents it. And this intrinsicality suggests that we also have R1. R2 is a part of R1. And so if we take those two, we have L1 equals L2. So that's the first reason to move on from a higher order theory to a self-representational theory of consciousness. The second reason, which is maybe simpler and deeper, is that it's true that a conscious state of S is a state S is conscious of. So that a mental state L1 is conscious if if there is the mental state L1 is conscious if there is a mental state L2 such that L2 represents L1.
So just I have a question.
Yeah.
So I see intrinsicality, but certainty, I don't really see what it corresponds to.
It corresponds to the fact that when I have a conscious state, I'm absolutely certain that I have this conscious state, which means that the way that I represent this conscious state is somehow infallible. It cannot be wrong.
Yeah, okay.
So I cannot have L2 without having L1.
Okay.
So if I cannot have L2 without having L1,
because R1 is the place where
it's the target. It's the conscious state.
But here you're saying R2 is inside of R1 is inside of R2.
Yes. The idea is that if I cannot have L2 without having L1, this suggests that L1 is somehow a part of L2.
R2 is the high order of consciousness.
L2 is the higher order state.
State.
And L1 is the mental state that is made conscious by L2.
Is it referring to R2 or is it made conscious by R2?
Both.
Both.
The idea is that by representing L1, L1 is made conscious.
Yeah, that's the magic trick.
So it's R1 that is conscious about R2.
Is L1 that is?
Conscious about R2.
No.
Oh, but
L2 is L1 that is conscious. Let's say it's a pain. Let's say L1 is a pain in the neck. L2 represents the subject as having L1, which is mental state that represents the dysfunctioning part of in the neck.
okay.
And this state the L1 is made conscious by L2.
It's
Okay.
in the certainty saying that R2 is dependent on R1 doesn't mean that the experience of R1 is necessarily in the experience of R2. The way that
So L2 need not be an experience here.
It's a mental state.
It's a mental state, and L1 is also it's a representation. That's why I call them R. L1 is a representation, L2 is a representation, and L2 represents L1. So I have let's say I have a pain, let's say think something most let's keep the pain. My pain is a mental state that just represents my neck as dysfunctioning.
Yes, okay.
And this might be an unconscious pain.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
it becomes a conscious pain when it's represented as being there by R2. Okay? And the idea is that when I'm in pain, I'm absolutely certain that I'm in pain. So R2, which says you have a mental state that represents, it cannot be wrong. It cannot say, oh, you have a pain while you don't have a pain. Which suggests that L1 is really a part of L2.
Okay, so maybe not. Okay, so if okay, so you're saying the difference between higher order theory is that it's bidirectional. That R1 goes to R2, or it can be embedded in R2, and R2 is also embedded in R1. So you need to find a way to identify R2 and R1.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that classical higher order theories claim that L2 and L1 are completely separated. But we seem to have some kind of phenomenological principle that say that we're certain that we have an experience and that our experience are intrinsically conscious, which seems to imply that higher order theories are not good. That we can keep a theory of consciousness based on this principle, but we have to identify L1 and L2, and so we have to claim that what we really have is something like that.
Yeah.
But the second argument is more interesting. Well, will be more useful. And the rest of the talk will just take for granted that some theories posit a self-representation, and we're gonna wonder whether this self-representation is problematic or not.
Okay, can I ask one
Yeah,
more question?
sure.
So just the arrow. So here the arrow, you didn't specify what it was explicitly.
It's a representation.
So, but how do you see it in terms of so because do you have a way to formalize it, or you mean is it a relation?
Yeah, that's but part of the problem is that most proponents of those theories are not, as far as I know, do not rarely explicitly specify the content of L1. But L1 could be something like, let's say that L1 represents the dysfunction in the neck. You could pass a perceptual example, like there's a table in front of, and so M1 would say, let's say the table is simpler. M1 would say, there's a table in front, and I am representing the fact that there's a table in front.
Okay.
So it would be self-representational in that way.
Okay.
Or it could say, there's a table in front, and this representation is true. So, in fact, I know few articles who are very specific about the content of L1. There is one by Kriegel in which he tries to specify very explicitly the content. But usually the idea is that there will be some kind of self-representation. So one way to self-represent is to say, let's say that you have a mental state which says there's a table in front, and this is a representation of the fact that there's a table in front. This would fit the bill.
I see. Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay. Don't hesitate to ask questions because
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
So Gregor, were you asking just like what do the arrows mean here? I think it's just they're intended to mean representation. However, representation gets cashed out.
Yeah, that's what Alexandre said, yeah.
Yeah. So I was trying to, as there was a discussion about things that are so representations. And the way to, let's say you have a pain and you don't need it's unconscious, you represent it and then it becomes conscious and it keeps its nature of being a pain. So you can say that R1 is inside of R2 when the R1 its content is a pain. I was just trying to see if how to understand this arrow in terms of embedding a state or just giving an equivalent of the state of R1 inside of R2 to see what is the nature of this arrow, or because sometimes arrow just means depends on or keeps some information about, but here it seems so the end if I understand well the answer of Alexandre, for me it's more like R1 is like kind of a process, R2 so it processes something, R2 processes something, and you have a way to put the process R1 inside the process R2 if you don't want to specify.
I think historically this literature is done mostly by non-technical or non-mathematician people, not entirely true. So the arrow is very unspecified. It's a bit like if we want to be generous, it's a bit like when Gaspar presented his work on modeling cognition with Turing machines and said, so here we're going to specify an arrow. We're not going to define it. We know that it must exist, but let's keep it ill-defined.
Yeah, but
I think we are not more.
The discussion is more subtle than this, much more subtle.
But you'll see, I'll give you one, in the second part, I will give you some example of self-representation in which it's very specified and
no, but because from the talking, just this arrow meant something the way you were talking about it, and it's right. It had a lot of it was not just an arrow. It's not just an unspecified arrow. It's something much more with meaning.
It represents.
Represents.
Or is about, refers to.
Yeah. But I should note that the way I think about it now, since about 2012, is in terms of acquaintance, which is a real relation. And this is partly because representation may not be a real relation. Like if I represent Santa Claus, it doesn't mean I'm related to Santa Claus because there isn't a Santa Claus. So that's one sort of problem with thinking about it as representation.
And the also the absolute certainty suggests something that like acquaintance, at least that was an argument. Acquaintance is a very direct relation. You cannot have one member of the relation without having the other one, or like a real relation.
Thanks a lot. Sorry for the long question, but okay.
It's not a dumb question.
No, it's not a dumb question.
It's a crucial question.
No,
Yeah,
I said
but
long question.
No, but it's important because I take those things for granted because I like taken for granted in discussion of those theories of consciousness, but it's important to make them clear. So the second problem, so that was the first problem why hot theories have been rejected in favor of self-representational theories by some. The second problem, it's called is the regress problem. It's what can call the extensional regress problem, and it's the following. Cool. Regress problem. So the regress problem is the fact it stems from the fact that usually when the mental state when I'm conscious, let's come back to this. I said that a conscious state of S is a state S is conscious of. But usually that's true when the state R2 that represents R1 is itself conscious. I mean, when I say, for example, that I'm conscious of the table, it's true and it works, but only if the state that represents the table is conscious. If I had an unconscious representation of the table, I wouldn't say I'm conscious of the table. And so we should apply the same here. We should say that the mental state R1 is conscious only if there is a conscious state R2. Let's put it like that. R1 is conscious if there is a conscious state R2 such that R2 represents R1. But now you see that there is a problem because we were supposed to explain consciousness, but then we have to posit another conscious state to explain the consciousness of our target state. And so it seems that if we want to explain that R1 is conscious, we will have some kind of regress. R2, why is R2 conscious? Well, because there is a state R3 conscious that makes it conscious. And why is R3 conscious? Well, because there is a state R4 that makes it conscious. And here, in fact, we don't need to have the infinite regress, but we have the choice of either an infinite regress or a circle. Something like that. The circle could be, or in fact, a tiny circle, which is self-representational. But the moral here is that if we want to have a theory of consciousness based on this meta-representational principle, we will have a non-well-founded theory of consciousness. That is, a consciousness in which our explanation of R1 being conscious is either circular or infinite. Okay? And what I'm gonna, and so what I would like to put forward a simple criticism on theories of consciousness which posit self-representation or non-well-foundedness. And I will try to put forward two criticisms, which correspond to two different things I've been working on to argue against those theory of consciousness, even though I haven't published anything on those theory of consciousness, and so that's what I'm going to start now. I will just need to. I will just introduce two notations. So non-well-founded theories of consciousness. So this will be NWT-C. And meta-representational theories of consciousness are one form of self-representational theories of consciousness are one form of non-well-founded theory of consciousness. So for example, self-representational theories of consciousness. Okay, and so when I thought about it, first I worked with a friend and colleague, Marie Guillot, I think it was maybe 15 years ago. We tried to argue against those theory, SRTC, by arguing that the self-reference involved must be pathological. And so I will try to explain what is pathological. And the idea was that, in fact, there is a huge literature on self-reference and self-representation. And this literature usually works with this sentence, LR, which say that LR is false. You might know this sentence, the sentence that represents itself as being false. And this is called the liar sentence. And it's paradoxical. Why? Well, because if LR is true, then we can say that, so we have that LR is false is true. So LR is false. But if LR is false, then LR is false is true. So LR is true. We have a paradox because we have a sentence that is true if and only if it's false. And it's usually considered to be bad. And so there's a huge history, in the history of philosophy, you have many different ways to solve this. One way radical was say that this, to deny that self-reference ever yields grammatical sentences. So this is the Russellian answer. Some have argued that this sentence is actually both true and false. Some have argued that this sentence is neither true nor false. Some have argued that its truth or its falsity depends on the context. There are tons of answers, but one thing that is sure is that this sentence seems problematic, and it's in that sense pathological. You have other self-representational sentences that are pathological, but for a somehow different reason. Consider TR. which is defined as a sentence which say that TR is true. This is a sentence that say of itself that it's true. It represents itself as being true. It's called the true stellar. The true stellar is a bit weird. It's a bit weird because when you look at it, do you think it's true or do you think it's false? What would you say?
One or the other, but nobody knows. That's my answer on that one.
Yeah, that's one answer. Some people say it's false because nothing could make it true. Some people think it's true because we should trust it. No, I don't remember the reason, but I know some people claim that it's true. The thing is that it seems that it's not clear to see what could help us decide. I think so. I wonder whether Sorensen thinks that it have a truth value, but no one knows what it is, and no one can know what it is. So you have tons of views, and so this one is problematic in a way because it seems its truth value seems to be over-determined. It has to be both true and false, and this one seems under-determined, and it's pathological for the same reason. For a different reason. Yes.
So if, for example, this one, if you fix T1 true, then there's no problem. But if you fix T1 false, then there's a problem because T1 is true, but then T1 is false.
This one, it's TR. No, if it can be if you say that it's false, it's no problem. It say that it's true.
And then it's false.
Yeah, so it's okay.
But then you need to start again, right? So it means TR is false. So it's strange because TR. Okay, no, it's true. So in both cases, it's true. Yeah.
No, it's and you have some cases of self-reference which are not paradoxical at all. So for example, let's say the short teller, let's call it SR, which say SR is short. This one is true. This is not problematic at all.
Okay.
And so when I try to use those things about self-reference to argue against self-representational theories, my aim was to do three things. And I will use my note because it's important. So my aim was to do three things to show that that the kind of self-reference involved in self-representational theories is pathological, and that if the kind of self-reference involved in self-representational theories of consciousness is pathological, then these theories cannot work. That's what I wanted to show. But in order to do that, I needed to do a couple of things. And I'll just give you I needed to answer three questions. What do we mean exactly, precisely, by pathological self-reference? So intuitively, we see that there's something fishy with the true stellar and the liar, nothing fishy in the short teller. But what exactly is it that we mean by pathological? When exactly is a self-representation pathological? And why would pathology here be problematic? I mean, many people think that the liar is all right, that it's just a sentence that it won. that is false, that is neither true nor false, or true or false, but that it's pathological because it's weird, but it doesn't mean that this sentence is impossible, it doesn't exist, or that doesn't mean anything. That's okay. And so my problem was that there is no consensual questions answer to these questions. And in fact, many philosophers have suggested that there is no possible informative answer to the second question: when exactly is self-reference pathological? There's no way to sort the good case from the bad case.
This context or in general?
In the context of the liar sentence and such things like that, but the claim is more general. The thing is that you can make if I say that everything Trump says is false, if he says that what I say is true, we have a paradox, but if he doesn't say that, we don't have a paradox. And so it can get very tricky to find some internal criterion. And so I've tried myself to answer those questions, and I will not give you the details. The details are in a paper, but still I'll give you and we'll see how this applies or not to self-representational theories. So my answer was that was based on the idea that the content of self-referential representation is defined in terms of the fixed point of a function, defined like an equation which say f of x equals x, where the content is x. And that we have a pathology of self-reference when f has no fixed point, then the definition fails, or more than one fixed point, or let's say more than two, well, or but two or more fixed points. In other words, I have tried to argue that when we define a sentence such as the liar, we define its meaning in terms of the solution of an equation like f of x equals x, and that this definition fails sometimes because it has no solution, no fixed point, or because it has two or more solutions. And the idea was that the case of the liar is a pathology. So we have paradoxes like the liar when no fixed point, and we have what some call hypodoxes like the truth teller when two or more fixed points. And so what is the function? So in the case of the liar, the defining function, the function that defines the meaning, is very simple in an extensional setting. When in extensional setting, meaning is either 0 or 1. The meaning of a true sentence is 1. The meaning of a false sentence is 0. It's a huge simplification for meaning. But in the liar sentence, the meaning of the sentence is supposed to be the fixed point of the sentence that associates true to false and and false to true, 0 to 1 and 1 to 0. It's a permutation of 0 and 1. And this function has no fixed point.
So here, F is the state, is the sentence in the case of the example you were giving before, right? So the thing tells you, so the proposition, or more precisely, the truth value of the proposition is your F.
The F is now, so for the liar, let's take the liar. We define it like that. And I claim that the meaning of the sentence is defined as the fixed point of the function which associates truth to falsity and falsity to truth. I won't give you.
But if I change L1 is false by any proposition that depends on L1, and I look at
then the function will change, will be different.
But then is the function so if you see it as a proposition and you look at its truth value, so you have a table of truth for L1, which is true or false, and then you have a function that associates, so L1 is false, you can see it as a function that sends 0 to something and 1 to something, which is basically saying that when the proposition is true, it's you're going to send 1, when it's false, 0. So here the function is just the indicatrix function of the proposition that you have on your right? If I, instead of putting L1 is false, I put P of L1, your function is just the function, your function F is indicatrix of P.
Indicatrix.
It means it sends 1 when P is true and 0 when P is false.
Yes.
That's your function.
So the question
is because here we have is false. If I take is true,
okay. No,
then the function is identity. It's
exactly.
one. Yeah.
Exactly.
And you can find finding the function is very easy. And so that's one way to approach self-reference. And yeah.
Is it that your F here is a sort of what is going to give you, let's say that X is a truth value. I based on what you say, I tend to interpret that X is a truth value. One. And F is it's kind of a sophisticated function because it entails that, okay, if you start from 0, is there a quote unquote semantic path or interpretation path that can lead you to 1? Basically. So if X is 0 and F of X is 1, then you don't have a fixed point.
Yeah.
Or you have multiple.
No, you have no fixed point with
in that particular case. Yeah. And I guess the relationship, what inspired you, or maybe you had this notion of fixed point as a long history in non-wellfounded theory, right? Because that is what one of the ways, if I remember a little bit, they found a way of justifying a non-wellfounded system by saying, if you have a fixed point, if the set is embedded into itself, but you don't necessarily yield this, infinite chain, which is problematic, etc. But you can find a fixed point, then it's okay. I mean, I remember something vaguely like that. Is it related? Or
it's related, but the notion of fixed point is much older than that. And here I use it in a much less technical way because it's used for difficult things to go to the infinity. Here it's just like an equation, like you can take the function 2x plus 1. And the fixed point of this function is x equal to x plus 1. You solve it. It has either one solution, or here it has one. And it's really a simple thing. And the nice thing is that my approach allows to solve many other paradoxes of self-references, like the Russell's paradox and I forgot the Richard's paradox and others. And so what does it say? What does it happen when you try to apply it to self-representational theories? That's the sad part. The sad part is that it's hard to say. It's hard to say why. Well, it's easy to find the function, but if your mental state is something like, let's say let's say that your mental state L1, let's say that it says something like there is a table and L1 is true, or I have L1 or whatever, then it becomes tricky because, well, first, as soon as we're not in an extensional setting, but in an intentional setting, and that we take meaning of sentences to be propositions, not just 0 or 1, then it gets tricky. It depends on the way we model the thing. And also, this little thing, the meaning of true and the meaning of I have a representation 1, or those meanings are very difficult. And so when I try to apply that to consciousness, I found that to self-representational theories, I concluded that I cannot have a general argument against for the claim that they need be pathological, but I couldn't have either an argument for the claim that they are not pathological. It was too complicated. It depends on the way you model meaning. It depends on the way you understand the meaning of something like true or representation. And so it didn't work. But I have another option. So after working on self-representational theories, self-representations, sorry, and self-reference, I worked on non-well-founded explanation more generally. And this is interesting for us because self-representational theories of consciousness do not just say that we have some representation that represents themselves. They say that this is a way to explain their consciousness. So they don't just claim that we have some self-referential representation that represents that so and so. They say that those involve a form of circular explanation, at least, well, some explicitly say that. And so now I would like to move on the second part on non-well-founded explanations.
Alex, before you erase everything, could you say one more thing about the function as you're thinking of it here?
Yeah, sure.
So just tell me briefly, what's the argument and what's the value of this function? So in other words, what's the input to the function? What's it a function of?
Oh, here it's content.
It's a function of contents, and it goes to what?
Here, depending on you, it's a function from content to content. So in an extensional setting, so from semantic value to semantic value, and to determine the function f, the nature of function f depends on your self-representation. If so, for example, in an intentional setting, the function for the liar sentence is a sentence that associate to P, the meaning to a proposition P, the meaning of P is false.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. And so in an extensional setting, it's quite easy because this associates 0 to 1 and 1 to 0. But in an intentional setting, it's just this. And as I say, it's hard to, well, even in an intentional setting, it's easy to see that it will be paradoxical. But in cases like P is true and stuff like that, the function will depend a lot on the way you model propositions and the way you understand truth.
I see.
But in a way I think it's a dead end. And
can you give the argument like why it's not good for why in the end it's pathological or it isn't? Is it because you refer to other things than the on which you're
okay, so
to see if it's true?
it's pathological because then when we define the liar, for example, we define the function as the solution of an equation, and this solution has no solution.
No, but you said after that it's not a good. In the end, you decided to abandon this.
Oh, why? Yeah. Why? Well, because first, self-representational theories of consciousness rarely specify exactly the content they posit, and we need to have the precise content.
Okay.
And second, even when you try to specify it yourself, if you go in an intentional setting where semantic values is not just 0 or 1 but a full proposition, then it becomes complex, and your result will depend on the way you model proposition and on the way you understand the predicates that are used for the self-reference, predicates like represent X or is true or is false. And those are very muddy waters. There are huge debates on the meaning of true, and I saw no way to. I tried a few things for non-trivial cases, and I didn't find any answer. But maybe there is a way to. But
Represent the true. What does it mean to something to be true? Or...
yeah, exactly. For the meaning of true, what is the difference between the semantic value of its training and the semantic value of its training is true? There are many propositions that are very different, and it's some say it means exactly the same thing, but there are many proposals, and the same goes for words like represent. There are many theories of what a representation is and of the way we should understand it, and so it really I found no way to solve this problem.
Could I say something like, for me, I was trying to think about exactly what happens when X has a truth value 0 or 1, and F is a function between 0 and 0, 1. The fact that you asked to have a fixed point, it limits a lot of the propositions that you will get that are the meaning for them, because you get only 4 functions basically.
But that's because we're in an extensional setting, and
yeah.
Why?
But still, it assumes that what is very strong is the meaning of truth in this setting. And could you say that is it correct to reformulate like something saying that this direction is not necessarily good because the value of truthness is already itself kind of a content, and that the meaning of this content is basically implicit in the way that you're going to write the notion of the meaning that will give to your proposition using a certain definition of truth. And so, in fact, you're hiding something, which is that the truth in itself has some conscious content, which is basically an implicit meaning that has been predefined by a conscious state, and that we're using it to give the same property to other objects that we define with respect to it. And the only thing you will get from this perspective is, in fact, going back to the meaning of the truth. So it doesn't you specify a certain notion of truth as being something that we experience, like something very strong, which is this is true or false. Most of the time, we cannot say this about anything, right? Truth and false really supposes that you have a clear way of talking about the objects that are, or state things about the objects you conceive. But so, would you say that trying to refine the notion of truth and defining in this setting concepts that are self-referential in an interesting way, which are fixed points that are like say multiple fixed points, is simply hiding the fact that you're in fact studying a certain kind of truth that contains already some part of a conscious experience, which is that it's not the nature of if you want self-referentiality in consciousness, you don't want to specify a certain form of self-referentiality, which is encoded in the way that you talk about truthness. I don't know if I convey what.
But his perspective is slightly different. He comes to us having worked on, if I may, Alexandre, to kind of translate between the two, because I know whatever I know is what he's talking about. You have been working on self-reference, not necessarily and not only applied to self-representation theory of consciousness, And here he's presenting to us his path of research through self-referential. Of course, we encounter the classical notion of semantics and truth values, because that's kind of key in those things. But the question of Grégoire is, well, I mean, one elaboration of what Grégoire is suggesting is like, what if now, like, you don't assume, I mean, like, that's the way I interpret it, or you don't assume something in reference to truth, truth table, truth values, etc. But now your object, your X, are something of a very different nature. For instance, it's a homogeneous space. That we have this theory that consciousness as a structure of space, etc. So if you try to capture your meaning or your phenomenology in a manner that is not related to, it's not the, forgive me for the vocabulary, classical semantics, if you will, but by things that are much more object-like spaces. And they may be very weird spaces, you climb or whatever. I know there is not a direct analogy. I mean, there is only analogy, not a direct mapping between self-reference and certain type of circular space. But I guess that was one of the things. Now, if you change your paradigm, we're talking about propositions that are richer, that are not just truths. Zero or one in the intentional setting, and then it becomes intractable as a problem. But because you have a hard time to define your object as the complex proposition that is not reducible to a truth. Now, if you try this kind of approach and you think about the phenomenology, say, take space and say, let's assume it's an homogeneous space, maybe you have some topological properties that are, and then you try to formulate, to have this kind of discourse over this type of object. How would can you go about that? Or do you always require to have this kind of value?
No. I think okay. So the framework here, I've developed it for sentences, not really mental representations. And in an extensional setting, which is kind of trivial with 0, 1 instead of full propositions. But if you try to apply it to mental states, then you need to take into account richer contents than 0 or 1, and it gets highly non-trivial. But I think the framework, the idea of that applies. But so when you said about truth and consciousness here, the truth applies to sentences which are not mental states, so they're not conscious in any sense. And I'm not sure I understood your question, but I think that what I said presupposes some things about what we mean by truth, and this is probably.
But like inside of the notion of truth, maybe if you, I'm trying to read, so another way to maybe like imagine that the notion of self-reference is something that is dynamical, and then it allows you to make sense of what's around you. And then you arrive to something that is clear about how to talk or how to represent the object. So you're conscious about something, or you're conscious about the fact that something is true. When you define the notion of truthness with respect to the way that you conceive this truthness, so being 0 or 1. But then, of course, a lot of things you cannot talk about it as being true in the sense of 0, 1, because it means that you need to formalize it in a way that allows you to talk about it. And in this setting, it's very clear because X is 0, 1, and you have only 4 functions. You're going to have only 2 functions, basically. I said 4, is 2, you're going to have. I know it's going to be 4 functions because you can have 1, 1. You're going to have 4 functions. And it's very limited in terms of propositions you can say. Because truth captures something way.
Okay, but you can have the same thing where X is not 0 or 1, but a proposition like it's raining or the sky is blue. And if you want to model those propositions, one way to do it using function is to say that the proposition is a function from possible worlds to truth. So it will be so it's a function from possible worlds to true and false, and then you can have it. But then it's very. What I'm saying is that with the layer, it's still easy to show that it's paradoxical because it will be disjoint sets of. You will have the complement, but if you take a proposition that tells you, for example, let's say that my mental state is conscious when it say not only it's raining, but it say it's raining and this representation is true, for example, then it's very hard to see even so for example, in a classical Lewisian semantics, a proposition is a function from possible words to true and false. So the meaning of the proposition is raining. It's roughly all the world in which it's raining. But what is in that framework the content of the proposition? It's true that it's raining. It seems that it will be the same, but it's not the same meaning.
I understand.
And so we need to have a finer way to model the meaning of propositions if we want all the framework to have sense, and then it becomes.
Yeah, but so my remark was really with respect to this, because you have to abandon this direction because it becomes too difficult. But this are too difficult to model. So I can see why, because this is in the sense that we do not think of things that complicated, talk about consciousness. I can see a naive way of saying, oh, it's true because we're not thinking of things so difficult when we're thinking about consciousness, but at the same time, you don't know how we built our conscious experience. And I was trying to see if there's another way of trying to escape the fact of having to build a very precise meaning of what we're talking about, which is saying by the nature of your choice of truth, like you're specifying a certain amount of things that you're talking about, which presupposes a form for them, a shape. And the shape is basically the content that we have given a priori to them through the truth value. So that was, but just instead of saying it's too complicated, so we have to abandon it, it's merely saying because we use self-referentiality seems to be something that doesn't depend, if it exists, it's not something that depends about saying if something is true or not. And when you choose the truthness, you're choosing a way of representing a conscious content, and it implies a lot of, that's what my, maybe it's completely bullshit and it's okay.
No, I don't say it's bullshit. I said that I have a. I'm not sure I get it. So maybe we can talk about it
Sorry,
later.
I would just like to say one more thing since you are there, is basically your 6-point criteria is a bit like type theory or it's a proposal to kind of decide what is pathological, non-pathological, and it's kind of seems like to be a way of choosing. But the question is, do we even, I guess that's your third question, do we need to eliminate those pathologies? Think about multi-stability. No, otherwise you end up having an identity function everywhere if you want to preserve it. It's totally possible, that we move to things that alternate. So basically what you reject as a paradox because you have two, if once it's true, then it's false, then it's true, then it's false. It's a cycle.
But
maybe that's okay.
Okay,
I mean,
I
really anticipate.
No, I understand your intuition, but what I would say is that if what I say in this paper, but I mean, it's very controversial, but I try to argue that at least, okay, so at least when we do it with sentence, we haven't defined them properly. But that is another that's a second problem, is that when we're talking about representations in the mind, we're not talking about things we create by stipulation. And we might say something like for bistable perception or something like that. We might say, okay, when I cannot define it by stipulation because my definition is indeterminate, but it might exist something that has, so I think that's right. That's also a problem with this approach, is that I show that we cannot define by stipulation some sentence, like the truth teller. I say that it's not well defined when we define it like that, but that doesn't mean that there might not be something like that in the wild, in the mind. It just means that I haven't defined it well when I say that. But no, okay, no, I think in a way it will be, so no, it will be it's a bit more interesting mathematically, what I will say, and I think it's a better argument against at least some self-representational theories of consciousness. So I will try to. So non-well-founded explanation. So this is a well-founded. So a non-well-founded explanation is an explanation when you explain things like that. Yeah, you explain x1 by x2. So x2 explains x3 explains x2, and it either goes to the infinite or you have a circle. To infinite, or we have something like x1 with two kinds of explanations, causal explanations and metaphysical or grounding explanation. An example of causal explanations is what you have in physics when one even provokes another one. Grounding explanation is something that does not imply a difference in time and a provocation. I say that, for example, this table is grounded on a bunch of atoms that constitute it. Okay, that's called grounding explanation. And so this one is diachronic. This one need not be synchronic, or at least it need not be diachronic. Okay, and non-well-founded explanations are a hot topic in philosophy since at least Plato and Aristotle. Why? Well, first, because if you want to explain one event, for example, why we're here today, you will have to invoke another event and then in the past. So, and it seems to be non-well-founded. And many philosophers have thought that non-well-founded explanations are bad. And so that instead of infinity or circle, we need to stop on something to have a stopper at the end, like God. Something that basic, a basic ground, so and something that does not need to be explained.
So this is on the infinite scenario.
They say that the infinite scenario cannot be the case, and the circle scenario cannot be the case, because they claim that in that case the explanation would be bad, would be vicious. We wouldn't have a true explanation like in the circle, and so they say that we have to.
And that applies for causal explanation too?
Yeah.
So when you have the Krebs cycle and you model the Krebs cycle, I'm thinking that's about that kind of circular and biochemistry, and you have some differential equation model, of course, they have a little delay, but it's not necessarily explicit. So that would not be for these people a problem.
No, because
only when you
even when you have feedback or whatever, it's still an event in the past. So it's not the same event that self-explained.
But I'm thinking about the model itself, mutually coupled differential equations. For instance, delta d of x over time equal some ax minus y, and d of y over time equal something that depends now on the other function, so the other variable. So you get something like mutual dependencies. Like x depend on y and y depend on x.
Yeah, but
there's
also different times.
Some models do not have delays.
It's just
you don't propagate the delay.
No, but
you have numerical constraints, so you.
It's continuous, but it's not.
It's not probable.
No, but well, there is an article that is forthcoming that argues that in such cases you have some kind of circular explanations, but I don't agree. But anyway, I'll try to argue that this and this need not be bad. And so, in fact, Aristotle and many others, they just claim that this is bad and that we need to end on something that doesn't need to be explained. We need a well-funded explanation. So a well-funded explanation is something like that. X1, X1, X2, X3, and you have X4, and you stop there. And there are a few arguments. There is, to my knowledge, the best argument against non-well-funded explanation comes from Leibniz on the radical origins of things. And in order to show that non-well-funded explanations, he gives an example. He says, imagine...
GPS perdu.
Okay. He said, imagine that you have a scribe. That has copied the elements of geometry from Euclid, and he has copied that because another scribe copied it earlier and passed it to him. And this other scribe has copied the elements of geometry because the third scribe before gave it to him, etc., to the infinity. He said that in such cases, we wouldn't have a good explanation. Why? Well, because an explanation must determine what it explains. In a way, and here he say, okay, this story, everything you told me, is compatible with the scribes copying something different from the elements of geometry. That is the explanation when I tell you the first scribe wrote the elements of geometry because he copied the exact same thing that he was given to, and he was given the elements of geometry in the third scribe. All this story, nothing in this story explain why they all copied the elements of geometry rather than the Bible. You see, the law just...
At the beginning, there is not...
Because there is no beginning. And so the idea here is that the story, this story only explains why they all copy the same book, while they all write the same book, not why this book is what it is. And so Leibniz's objection basically is that non-well-funded explanation will be underdetermined. And so they will be bad because an explanation should determine what it explains. When you have an explanation of why this pen falls at 4 meters per second when it's on the ground, you can deduce from the laws and the initial condition that it will fall at this speed. So it's fully determined. And so that's basically Leibniz's objection to the infinite scribe. And I think it's so some people, the infinite scribes, so some people have argued that this is an objection, okay, but that the well-funded explanation are somehow in the same well, have the same problem because they have to stop on X4. And so, for example, I said that the first scribe copied the element of geometry because the second scribe copied the element of geometry, and because the third scribe, and because the fourth scribe gave them the elements of geometry. This explanation is good for X1, X2, and X3, but we don't explain X4. So we don't explain why all the... And so some people like Graham Priest and Ricky Bliss have said, okay, non-well-funded explanation are somehow undetermined, but the well-funded explanation are not better because they have to presuppose the first element that they don't explain. Okay.
Well, that's again the from restriction, because the object you chose needs to be kind of authenticated. For instance, the X4 is giving the element of Euclid. We don't know if it's true, but it could be actually Euclid giving his own element that he just wrote, but maybe that's not the actual element he was. So the uncertainty comes from the fact also of the semantics and the underdeterminacy of the content that is related to the particular
language or representation, because if you use some math, some basic definition, mathematical definition,
No.
that can work perfectly.
No. It's not the problem. No. It's just
X4 equal to.
No. It's a sort of experiment. But you can take if you take the Big Bang. The idea is that okay, you've explained everything from the Big Bang, but you haven't explained the Big Bang.
Choices.
But that's not the objective of
Choices
explanation.
of the definition
okay.
of axioms.
In a way, that's what they say. They say that okay, that circular or infinite explanation do not explain everything, but it is only bad if you expect them to explain everything. And my point is, so that's Bliss and Priest objection. But I think Leibniz's objection misses something, and that in some cases, non-well-founded explanations can indeed be better, and can indeed explain things that other explanations cannot explain. To see that, you can take first a trivial case. So just this infinite script objection, Leibniz is interested by the infinite case, but you have the same with the circular case. Imagine that your scribe copied the elements of geometry because some guy gave him the elements of geometry. And why did this guy had copied the elements of geometry? Well, because the second scribe traveled back in time and gave it to the first scribe. Do you see the? And this is something known as time travel hypodox. Imagine a story where do you know why Shakespeare wrote all these books, all those books? Because someone came from the future with the complete works of Shakespeare and gave them to a guy named Shakespeare who said, "Wow, it's great, and we'll publish them." Then you have also something that is underdetermined in the explanation. You haven't explained
when it started.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the same intuition that Leibniz have here, that there is something that is not explained. You don't have, for example, the books, the complete works of Shakespeare could contain less works or more. Your explanation is consistent with them being very, very different. And there's something like mysterious. Where does it come from? And okay, but you see that first a trivial answer to Leibniz. Imagine that our scribes are monomaniac. A monomaniac scribe is a scribe who copies the element of geometry, whatever he's given. So you give him, you say copy, you give him the Bible, and you say copy me this book. The guy is so monomaniac that he copies the elements of geometry. Then, in Leibniz's example, you have explained everything that is to be explained. Okay, but I might understand that you a trivial answer, not a less trivial answer. The stick stretchers. So instead of scribes, stick stretchers. A stick stretcher is someone who, when he's giving a stick of length X, so this is L, he transforms it, he stretches it, or he cuts it to make a stick of length X minus L divided by 2. So this will be something like so. So he cuts the stick, or he stretches it to make it closer to a stick that is L long. Each time he reduces it So you have L, and here you are. And here you have X minus X1. Okay. So if the six structures do that, and if it goes to the infinity, you're sure that the stick at each step will be L long. So here, everything that needs to be explained is explained. Do you see the because this tends to it tends to L, so when you iterate it an infinite time, and so as there will always be an infinitely many steps beyond, you know that the stick at each step will be L long. And it's the same with time travel. You can imagine that a stick stretchers time travel and gives a stick. You can deduce mathematically from the laws of the example, that is the behavior of the stick stretcher, that the stick will be L long. So here you have non-well-foundedness, but determinacy. Okay, and you can have
In the case of the cycle, it's not the same because the stick will be always of size L, right?
Yeah.
But in the other one, the stick is not necessarily of size L.
Yes, it will always be of size L because there will always be infinitely many stick stretchers.
If I take X3,
Yeah.
I start with X1, which has size X, right? Then
Yeah.
X2 has size.
No. It's you start with
Okay.
It's backwards. It's backwards. So the idea here again is that in some case, like Leibniz, it's underdetermined, like the hypodox. But in some case, it's perfectly okay. But it depends on what I call the flow function of explanation. And so I will talk to that a bit later.
Is that related to Zeno paradox? In one way to explaining it is by using differential calculus. You cut in half the remaining length of the path every time.
No, okay.
But then eventually, because you cut in half, and assume you are going at a fixed speed, you can in half also the time you take to go there. And so if you write a simple integral, you can get a solution to that.
It's not really related because here in this example, I took a continuous example, but you can take discrete cases. In the paper, I have an example with a guy who turns wheels with numbers, and so there is a shallow similarity between both, but it's not grounded on properties of the continuous. Or
it's not the passage à la limite.
here there is, but you can have the same without passage à la limite. So, for example, in my the monomaniac scribes is a trivial example. You have non-trivial examples with no that do not rely on continuity or even infinity. You have some cases in which you just need to have 100 people before to get. If you want a case where the explanation is over-determined, you can take the recalcitrant scribes. The recalcitrant scribe is someone who, when you give him the elements of geometry, he copies the Bible, and when you give him the Bible, he copies the elements of geometry. If you have such explanation, you cannot know whether X1, X1, if you start by supposing that it's the element of geometry, you can prove that it will be something else and vice versa. You have something wrong. It's like, and in the time travel case, it's equivalent to the grandfather paradox. So imagine that you travel back in time and you kill your grandfather. Then how can you exist? The same thing with the scribe, the recalcitrant scribe who has the elements of geometry. He goes back in time and he gives him to.
He gives the Bible.
He gives the Bible.
To the next. Is that the recalcitrant?
Yeah, but then, well.
I mean, it seems determined if you start from X1, let's say that X1 has the Bible in his hand. So X2 has given to X1 the Bible, but X2 maybe add the element of the kid in his hand. And if it's systematic, you have the element, if you have the element, then you give the Bible. You can go downstream, not upstream instead. You can start from X1 and not go to up to infinity. You cannot. But locally, you can perfectly reconstruct the chain of books.
No, okay, but
That's not the problem.
you can, but you have two consistent assignation that with the same laws, it could be the first one could have the Bible or the elements of geometry.
It depends on the final condition, not the end.
Yeah, and there is no final condition. Well,
Yeah, that's true. In terms of causality, chain of
Yeah.
explanation.
but and so here to model that, the idea is when you have an explanation, you have laws. If you explain, let's say, x1 by x2, always you will have a function such that a function that depends on the law, such that f of x2 equals x1. I call that the flow function, like in dynamical system, and it comes from. It seems to be a constraint on explanation that it determines what it explains. Some philosophers say it's a determination relation, and from that you can get that there will here the flow function is the function that associates x minus L divided by 2 to x. In the infinite scribe object case, the flow function is the identity function of our book contents. A scribe takes any book content and he writes a book with the same content. And if you do the math, you can see that the explanation will be complete. That is, will explain all the items, x1, x2, if and only if the intersection of the images of F is a singleton. And in fact, if there is no, if it's more than a singleton, you will have an underdetermination case. With identity, it's everything. It's all the book contents. And if it's less, you will have an overdetermination case if there is no intersection.
F prime
It's not F prime. It's F to the power I. So it's F applies to F, applied to F, applied to F. And so you can see that if you have a metric space, this condition will be fulfilled if F is K contractante. I don't know how to say that in English. So if you have a metric space with a measure, you have a sufficient condition is that F is bounded and for all x, y, F with K or something like that. So you have a Picard theorem from I don't know his name, who tells you that then who allows you to show that this condition will be satisfied in such cases. And this is interesting because you can here those are cases in kind of simple cases of causal explanation, but you have nice cases of in the case of grounding explanation, and one of them is the that I use is Sierpinski triangle. So Sierpinski triangle is the figure you obtain when you iterate this operation. That is the Sierpinski triangle. So you iterate this operation, tac, tac. And you do that again. So, and you do that with infinity, and here you have a case in which the triangle is grounded on three tiny copies of the same figure, which are grounded on three tiny copies on the same figure. And what is fun is that you have this condition which is satisfied with the distance, and this corresponds to the fact that you will have the same figure, whatever the triangle you start with. The triangle you start with can be just a full triangle, but it can also be a triangle that contains fishes. So I don't know if you see, but here, instead of starting with a black triangle, or you start with a fish, and you get the same figure at the end. That's why the non-well-funded is not a problem. It's because by going to the infinity, you arrive at the limit to the same thing, whatever you start with. So it's just like the stick stretchers, but more technical thing. And you can have fun, and you can see that with grounding explanations, you have the same phenomenon. You have some good explanation, bad explanation, complete well-funded explanation, complete non-well-funded explanation, and incomplete non-well-funded explanations. But so my question is, how does that apply to consciousness? And
Before you get into that,
yeah.
we have a colleague, a friend, Kenneth Williford and I, named Gregory Landi, who is a specialist of Rostock. And he's convinced, and he has a very familiar argument, that really what matters is impredicative concept formation. Concept formation that are not predicative, impredicative. So they allow some form of circularities, but they can be controlled perhaps better than a full-fledged non-well-founded set-theory. Do you, number one, what do you know about impredicative concept formation or set formation? And is what you are talking about here related to that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So especially what I was talking of before, in fact, what I was giving was impredicative definitions of sentences. And my claim was that some were good and some were bad. And it's like when you define something with an equation with x on both sides, in a way, it's a circular definition. In some cases, it's good, but usually in mathematics, you have to prove that you define just one thing, one and one thing. And so impredicative definitions can be good, it's just circular definitions. And my claim was simply that they can be good, but they can be bad too. And we need to check, and we need to have a proof that we have defined one thing and just one thing, not many different things. And basically my claim was that the liar and the truth teller are simply impredicatively defined sentences that are bad. And that's others are impredicative defined sentences that are good.
So when you now consider that set theory and your object is a set, and not a proposition, and your self-reference is, by analogy, literally self-membership. Which ontologically, when you start thinking about sets, sometimes you think about them as concrete objects. You can start thinking about concrete objects that belong to themselves. And it's much better than I do, and you probably know that much better. But I think there is one of the guy who was involved in, sorry for my ignorance, in non-wellfounded set theory, say that the identity, I mean, the uniqueness comes from identity in terms of the graph. You can, you have non-well-founded sets. You can write a graph, it looks, because they are not just hierarchical graph. And if you can prove that, there are two non-well-founded sets that have the same graph, then they are unique or identical.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm bringing stuff that may be not related to that.
Yeah, it's related. I'm not an expert on non-well-founded set theory, but I would say that the impredicative definition, the circular definition fails or doesn't fail. You could also modify the underlying math so that the definition that fails start not to fail. So, for example, if your definition designates two things, if you try to move in a space where those two things are identified. So, for example, and I guess this is something like that you do with impredicative with not well-founded set theory, but I'm not.
Yeah, that's basically correct, what you just said. So
Okay.
there's the anti-foundation axiom that comes from, I think, from Peter Axel, that allows you to individuate sets without extensionality by relating them to the graph and to basically,
Yeah.
if all the graphs that represent this set are isomorphic, then A and B, then A and B are identical. Because any set will be representable by, or many sets will be representable by more than one graph. But if you take the whole set of graphs that represent the sets, if those two sets are isomorphic, then you've got one set according to that axiom. That's
Yeah. So.
a little more technical than that, but that's basically the idea. And then there's Baffa's axiom, which basically says, no, you can just postulate as many isomorphic but distinct non-well-founded sets as you want. So you just kind of, then the individuation is in a way outside of the theory.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
if you have the anti-foundation axioms, for example, there's only one self-singleton, a set that
Okay.
only.
Okay.
But in Baffa's axiomatization, you could have as many self-singletons as you want that are distinct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in here it's to identify things that seem distinct and likewise, for example, imaginary numbers. You have an equation that defines nothing, and you add something to your space so that it defines something. But so just so could we apply that to? I haven't really given the philosophical justification for my claim about the connection between what happens to the flow function and what happens to the explanation being complete or not complete. But
Maybe you can guess the gist of it.
but I guess well, the idea is that, well, I think if what I said about the math is correct, then you see that there is no choice, that everything will be fully determined because all the elements in the explanation will fall in this will fall in this image of the infinite iteration of f. And so if it's equal to a singleton, then everything a singleton E, then every item will be equal to E. But no, but what is, well, yeah, okay. So just let me try to give you a hint about the way we could try to apply this to
non-well-founded to a non-well-founded theory of consciousness. So let's suppose that we have R1 and R2 that represents R1 and R1 that represents R2. Okay, suppose that we have that. And the flow function is the function that explains how a conscious state makes another state conscious when it represents it. One interesting thing is that here it can be a grounding explanation, so we don't have problems about synchronicity. So this function will apply to, let's say that R2, let's say that the representation is defined as a pair with a content and 0 or 1, depending on whether it is conscious. So 0 for unconscious and 1 for conscious. The idea here is that, let's say that R1, so R1's content is C1 and R2's content is C2. The flow function, the function that associates to C1 to, let's say, R2 to yeah, C2. So if we have C2 which is unconscious, and so it applies to then C1. I have to write it smaller. So to C1 0 and C1 0, it will associate. So if both states are unconscious, then no state will make the other one conscious, right?
Yeah.
So we'll have C2 0, C1 0.
Sorry,
He's defining the function.
no, but where does the assumption that if two states are conscious?
It stems from the fact that that was a fact that motivated non-well-founded theory.
Okay.
We'd say that in order to make a state conscious, a mental state must itself be conscious.
Yeah, I remember the one.
So
it's a build upon that.
Yeah, that's why. And so, well, first let's just go that way, R2 to R1. And if C2 is conscious, and if C1 is unconscious, then we'll have C2 conscious, and then it will work. So sorry, my 1 is bad, and C1 will be conscious. Okay, and if C1 is already conscious, well, then both will be conscious. And if C2
is unconscious, but C1 is already conscious, then it will be the same again. So here you can see that this function has a couple of fixed points. It has unconscious, unconscious, and conscious, conscious. And so what this implies is that this
The third one is also has 3 fixed points.
What about the fourth one? Are you sure you want to write?
Third, 1 and 2.
this one. No, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, 2 and 3.
Yeah, you're right. And so the problem, what that means here is that this explanation, when you have a circle, or even when you have a circle like that, a tiny circle, is that this explanation will not determine, it's consistent with all the states being unconscious and all the states being conscious, which means that it doesn't explain why they're conscious rather than unconscious. Like in the infinite scribe, it doesn't explain what is the Bible rather than the. So
Maybe this is building the assumption at the beginning. From the beginning, where you started saying, one of the issues with the hot theories is that in fact, with this implicit like presupposition of consciousness, the very property we want to define. So now you're bringing back this type of model in a secular manner in which we have to assume in the instance of a pre-existing consciousness to make another one.
But my point.
I'm not saying it's not good, but I'm saying it's follow from there.
So my conclusion here, what we should conclude for that is either the argument to move from higher order theory to self-representational theories, or at least the second one, either this argument is rejected, or if it is accepted, then we should maybe reject explanations of consciousness in terms of the meta-representational principle. And philosophers like Michel Henry, for example, would claim that consciousness is purely immanent. It has nothing to do with representation.
Okay, perfect. And now you can start. Okay, perfect. Sorry, so we had to change the setup. So we're in my office now. So we can start for the questions. So maybe you can start.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when it comes to the issue of explanation, like I never, so I mean I always accepted the idea that the conscious states are the ones that we're aware of being in, like all the hot people say, but I never thought of the idea, they talk about the higher order thought making the lower order thought conscious, or I never thought of that as particularly plausible as an explanatory story. So for me, the pre-reflective self-consciousness, which you can model in a non-well-founded set theory and other ways, is a datum. It's just part of the data that you want to explain, but it's not itself an explanans. It's something to be explained by a model of consciousness. It's not something that does any explaining, in my view.
But isn't it the fact that it represents itself or that it's acquainted with itself that explains that it's conscious?
For me, that's just like a feature of consciousness.
Okay, descriptive. You mean your model is descriptive rather than explanatory?
Explanatory, yes, because I think for explaining consciousness, the explanation is going to be outside of that. It's going to be so my thought is something like you create a model of consciousness that's descriptive, and pre-reflective self-consciousness is one of the data, and you can capture it with non-well-founded set theory, for example. Maybe you can capture it other ways. Um, and then you have this model of consciousness, and really explanation would amount to, determining how that kind of model gets realized. It wouldn't be the way that higher thought people tend to talk, I think, is misleading. So in that sense, I think you're right. I mean, your argument, if I understand it, would work against them if you thought that that was what explains consciousness in some way. It doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we were kind of talking about that with David after the talk while we moved from there to here. And so I have a question for you then. So how do you get the regress started, the extensional regress?
Mhm.
How do you get started
So
if there's no appeal to explanation?
So I look at that as more like if you thought that you could account for, or you could adequately describe self-consciousness in the regressive way,
Mm-hmm.
like there's no need for you to do that. So if you accept this principle, if you accept that, yeah, the conscious states are the ones we're aware of being in, so you could accept that as just a description, a fact about conscious, and then ask, how should we represent that, or how should we think about that? And then, okay, there's one way, which is the regressive way. As far as I know, only Spinoza ever said, yes, that's right. All right. Accepted that kind of, which is, as you point out, is a form of non-well-foundedness, technically speaking, but the non-circular variety. So you could say, well, we don't need to do that. We can take a page from Aristotle and Brentano and Sartre and say, no, it's just aware of itself. So that would be a way of representing that feature that's a non. So the way I think about that regress argument is,
Okay,
it's not
okay,
explanatory. It's about adequately representing it.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. I get it. Interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm wondering, maybe this kind of criticism that I try to put forward a bit tentatively, maybe it could target some other advocates of self-representational theories of consciousness who try to put forward a theory of consciousness that explains consciousness in terms of intentionality, let's say.
Yeah, I think that sounds plausible to me. Yeah. And I would agree with that. Yeah. That it's not explanatory. Yeah. But I really like your way of distinguishing between adequate and inadequate, I guess, non-well-founded explanations.
Mm-hmm.
It's very cool. Yeah.
Okay, cool. It's I'm happy to see you also through the camera, because I didn't see you before. I was
Yeah.
I
But
was-
then
Well, I haven't seen you in many years, so we both got
on this basis,
older.
how heuristic or generative a model based on non-well-founded set theory or non-well-founded self-reference, whatever, could be. How you connect it to the rest of the science to be done. My question is like, is that something we can start from? Say, okay, the phenomenology looks non-well-founded. So therefore, there is this non-well-founded set theory, or various version, there are problems of regress, but we can solve them actually, blah, 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 blah. So then we say, no, now we have a mathematical structure, object, or whatever we can use, and we should work the math from there to see what we can derive from it that capture maybe other properties of consciousness we did not put into that, which is exactly the epistemology we use with the projective consciousness model at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, and here we see that with this type of math, we can explore a lot of things, make predictions that are very specific and very incarnated, embodied, and perception, imagination, action, planning, motivation, blah, blah, blah. Now, if we start from an object like a non-well-founded set, I know you don't want to talk about set, but what can we do with the math to go beyond that? Because that's the virtue of a model, is to tell you more than what you put into it to begin with. You need to learn something from the model. So that's it's a good framework from a modeling standpoint. But that's key question to me. Still unsettled.
Yeah, for me too.